Well, good evening. It sure is wonderful to be back at the Mariners Museum. This evening, I'll take you on a 40-year journey of a site investigation from its discovery through analysis and interpretation and all the way to publication and maybe beyond. The story starts at the mouth of the Hudson River, where sits the island of Manhattan. And people lived there for thousands of years. The climate was fine for agriculture, fish all around it, enemies far across the water. The Europeans came and explored there, the Dutch, especially in the early 1600s, and they established New Amsterdam, which was a trading post, little village and then a town, and filled over the shallows around here. There's a mud flats at low tide and shallow water heading out like most coastlines. They filled it so that when they had ships in, the ships could eventually come right up to shore as opposed to mooring out in the river and then having small boats go back and forth. And of course it added to the land, but that wasn't so much worth it. The English took the island from the Dutch in the 1680s, and they continued to do exactly the same. In fact, they allowed the Dutch to stay there as long as they put up the British flag. And so they continued to build the town, eventually became a city, and they kept building out into the East River and into the Hudson. The ship we're going to talk about, the site today, in 1981, Howard Ronson bought a block in the financial district and hired SSI archaeologists to lead the archaeology to excavate, which he was required to do before they started construction. He planned to put up a 30-story office building. The archaeologists who were doing it, they were terrestrial archaeologists, and they were excavating all about the settlement there, and they ran into the ship. But first, I'm going to talk about three other ships, old ships that were in New York, so you don't get confused, because you may have read about them or heard about them. So the Dutch were doing some exploration there in 1613, and one of the ships, Tiger, which that's the closest I can come to the Dutch, caught fire and had to be abandoned. And it was somewhere along the Hudson River. Weren't sure exactly where. But in 1916, when they were digging a tunnel for the subway, and the excavation crew found some timbers, they thought it might be the Tiger. And it was only about 8 feet of keel and I think 3 frames, and that was about it. So for years it was the Tiger, and then somebody said, oh, but it doesn't look Dutch to me, so it was an American ship. So it was an American ship. And then it became the Tiger again. And last I knew, a Dutch expert had come over and said, that's definitely American wood, and it's definitely from the 18th century, not 17th century Dutch. So that's where it is now. If you want to see it, it's at the City Museum in New York. Then in 1978, underneath the South Street Seaport Museum, they were fixing the plumbing and the drainage system or something under one of the buildings, and they ran into parts of a colonial era wooden ship. The trouble with it, they couldn't dig it, they couldn't excavate without taking down their building, and they didn't want to do that. So all we have is some quick drawings of what was found right there, and that was it. And in 2010, at the World Trade Center, this would have been where an entrance ramp was. They were excavating to build the new World Trade Center, and they had to have an archaeologist looking over it. They found a ship. I got a call, can you come down and take care of this ship for us? It was just some bottom timbers, but an interesting vessel. We think it was built around Philadelphia area in the just about the time of the Revolution. So, ship tonight is none of those, okay? All right, so let me backtrack. All right, 1981, while the Ronson had bought the land and hired archaeologists to go in there. At that time, I was a graduate student, and I had spent the semester, that fall semester, studying how the English Empire, well, it became British Empire, went from being a kind of tertiary, small country with a few colonies at the beginning of the 18th century. By the end of the 18th century, it was the largest empire the world has ever known. How did that happen in one century? Well, a number of economic historians and social historians and political historians had written about this, and so I had to read all the stuff from my graduate school and come up with a report. And what they found was that it was a little frustrating. They couldn't put their finger on it because the cost, one thing is that the cost of moving goods across the Atlantic between 1713, Treaty of Utrecht, to 1754, in that approximately 40-year period, the price of moving goods across the Atlantic dropped in half. And how did that happen? Well, they had bigger containers, they had building up port facilities to get rid of the pirates, they had developed a credit system, but if you put all those things together, even synergistically, it didn't add up to halving the cost of moving goods. And so Ralph Davis, one of the economists, just hypothesized that had something to do with the ships. Maybe they become more efficient, but nobody had ever found one. Well, the problem with the merchant ships is that nobody recorded how they built them. There are a lot of records of how they built the warships, because those are government ships. Or government transports, yep, got it. Gunboats, got it. All that stuff's in the archives. Merchant ships, it's not there. There are just a few manuscripts saying sort of how I built the merchant ships, but it doesn't really tell you how it was done. So we've always assumed it was a secret, that there was some way that they built these ships and they kept it a secret because it kept them employed instead of putting the word out on how to do it right. Because if you think about it, in those days, you had to move a ship through storms, even if, they didn't have weather reports, but even if they saw a storm coming, you can't outrun it. You were in it. And you're crossing the Atlantic, a wooden ship, and somehow you want to get to the other side and not die, and then turn around and come back and forth, back and forth. You got to have a really good ship to do that, and yet they kept it a secret. So I ended up my report saying, I've got a master's in nautical archaeology, and with this PhD that I'm getting in history, maybe I should go out and look for one of these things. So at the same time, without knowing it, well, actually about 3 weeks after Christmas, the archaeologist ran into the ship. So Shelley Smith and I got a call, hey, we found this ship and we don't have any ship archaeologists and you guys are into colonial ships. Can you come down to New York? And she was busy, so I went down. And sure enough, it was put down. They had found it in a trench that they had dug with a backhoe, just testing some area. And so I got into a backhoe and the bucket, not the driver's seat, and they lowered me down. And I was looking at the side of it, going, OMG, this is exactly what I just wrote about. I just spent a semester studying and hoping to eventually find one of these. Nobody had found one. And here it is. And look at how much there is of it. Probably 2/3 of the hull was there. And so, but the archaeologists had to be out of there by the end of January. And this was mid-January. There were 2 weeks left before the archaeologists had to leave and construction would start on the buildings. So we started to do a test pit in the middle of what we thought was the middle ship. We were pretty close to see what was going on. We didn't even know what the bow and stern was, just going for it. And this is where we were. The ship is to your bottom right, and South Street Seaport was right up nearby, and you can see the Brooklyn Bridge in the background, and where the ships for South Street Seaport, for those of you who know New York. And here we are starting the test bit down and through. Came down very quickly on the lower deck, the main deck of the ship. There was a gun port there, and the deck was there. And in underwater archaeology, you end up usually finding just the bottom timbers. And here we had ship. So this was very exciting. And we asked if we could possibly excavate the whole thing. So they said, we'll write up a proposal and we'll see. Well, they said, but it's going to cost us $10,000 a day while you do that, just because we're not starting. If you go into, that's for the February. If we go into March, it's about $50,000 a day, and that's in 1980s money. So we made up a plan for February and asked for 35 people and some pumps and et cetera, et cetera. And I made the spiel to them and told them how significant this site was. And the developer said, we'll give you February, just be out of here on the 1st of March. And so I said, really, I didn't expect him to say that. We were hoping for a couple more weeks. So I said, well, I have to redo the budget. He said, you don't have a budget. You just spend what you need. We'll go over what you spent afterwards. But you said you needed 35 people. I want to see 45 people on the site. I want to see people, always want to see a few people waiting. I don't want you at the first day of March saying I was one person short. And you asked for 3 pumps, you're going to have 5 pumps, and you're going to have a union pump operator, et cetera. But he said, do everything perfectly. I'm looking at a site. We're in February in New York, and things covered with mud, and I was like, perfectly, you know? They said, really? I said, do the best you can. No shortcuts. If it costs money, spend it. But get out of here in March. So we did. Organized it, and we started. Every day we were there, it was either snowing or freezing rain or it was a windstorm, which you could hardly stand up, except for one day, right to the end. We had one sunny day. As we went down, now the top of the ship of what was left was 8 feet below street level. And we excavated by hand, shovels, trowels, buckets, pretty much like you do it on land, only we were moving. And we saved 10% of the soil to get sifted through to find artifacts. Found thousands of artifacts. What he's standing on there is the lower deck, which normally would have been going across, and it's collapsed down. And behind him, up here, you see the collapsed upper deck. So in some sections, we had 2 decks collapsed down in. And there's actually a gun port just over to the side you can't see. But he's talking on a walkie-talkie. There was so much noise at the site. If those of you who saw the video probably said, gee, that's kind of noisy. It was very noisy. We had a steam pile driver moving. They were preparing the site for this building. They had a steam pile driver going over to the side 30 feet away from the ship. They had a giant excavator going with no muffler on the diesel, of course. So if you were 15 feet away, you couldn't yell loud enough to the person for them to even hear that you were yelling to them. So the walkie-talkies came in handy. We got cheap ones, figuring we'd drop them in the mud by mistake, but they all lasted. We let the ship fill with water every night. We were below the water table, so we let it fill every night so that the wood wouldn't freeze. And then we had someone go in an hour earlier and get all the pumps going so that when we started, we could proceed. Now, this is the same area. He would have been standing there, but we're on the other side. So the other site, we were looking north, which was toward the bow, and then this time we're looking south toward the stern, and that's where it's better clean, and it's still got the cargo hold below. Now, the safety engineers, I should back up a bit. Going across the ship were these brick walls. What had happened was this ship had been brought in. As we went down, we could see what had happened. The ship had been stripped of everything, and then at high tide brought in to the shore and spiked to some pilings, and then filled with ballast from other ships that were coming in from England and the Caribbean. And so then they built buildings over it, 3-story brick buildings. And for those of you who know a little bit about structure, you build a foundation wall down and then you put it on a spread footer or a footer and to spread the weight. They use the ship for that. They use the ship timbers. So the guys who were building the buildings knew there was a ship down there, but that was kind of lost to mind later on. Those buildings were built, I think, mid-19th century, early 19th century. So during the evenings, Shelley and we co-directed the site. She came down and we co-directed the site. She took care of the recording and other things of the vessel, and I took care of more of organizing who was where and what was going on, and that sort of thing. And then afterwards, our arrangement with the developer and with her was that I would continue with the research. She already had some projects she had to work on afterwards. But in the evenings, we developed contingency plans. It's just something I like to do for various situations that might pop up. We were hoping we could save the bow because it teaches us quite a bit about the ship. We knew nobody would let us keep everything. So we kept a few pieces of the ship that we thought might be important for analysis later on, put them in a pool of water. And we had a plan to take apart the bow just in case. And 2 weeks before we were out of there, which was halfway through, the city of New York said, "Can you save the bow?" We, yes, we have a plan for that. Now, the bow was, all those timbers, there are 2 ways that they were put together, were held together. One was with wooden trunnels, which are like big wooden pegs. So you drill a hole and you stick this octagonal peg through the whole thing, and then you've got a octagonal piece of oak in an oak round circle. It's tight, it's going to hold. And the other way was with these big iron spikes or bolts or whatever. Well, this was spent centuries underwater. The iron was gone. It was just sort of a mushy powder. And so the only thing holding this ship together were the trunnels. And they were holding it. You couldn't just take those things off. You had to wedge them off. So we cut some 2x4s into wedges and got 3 mallets. And this one big husky archaeologist, he did weightlifting and everything. "You're going to take this apart." And he, bam, bam, bam. And he just, with all the wedges, got it off. And then this is Abby Jarslow there, one of the archaeology graduate students who was working with it. And she saw me rigging some stuff up. And I know how to do that. But she had been a rigger, a union rigger for 2 summers when she was in college in New York City. So she knew all how to do it, finesse, and she could finesse the operator, the crane operator, with little hand signals that I'd never even heard of to move it sideways and up and down. She just did a wonderful job. And that's how the timbers came up so nicely, and they went into a pool of water. Well, here we are in the cargo hold. This is with the ceiling. The ceiling planking is that inner planking that seals up the ship. There's outer planking and inner planking. The inner plank is called ceiling planking. And that's all there for those of you who are into shipbuilding. The clamps there you see. And that's a waterway up there. And that would be the lower main deck. So we're in the cargo hold. And notice the fill. Now there's a wall of fill here. And what you're seeing here is beach stone from the coast of England. And here's some brain coral from the Caribbean. And then you get into volcanic sand, also from the Caribbean. So later on, we didn't know it in the field, we saw that, but later on when I put all the data together, what we had were humps of these different ballasts from other ships underneath where the hatches were on the ship. So when they brought the ship in, it still had the decking and the hatches, and what happened was remember your basic history of the ships coming in with manufactured goods from England, right? And those are worth a lot of money compared to the stuff going back out toward England, which would be corn, wheat, fur, tobacco, which had a large volume per value. So the ships coming in to America had to have excess ballast in order for the ship to sail right. And when they got there, they had to get rid of it. So they weren't allowed to just dump it in the harbor because the harbor would fill up where you don't want it to fill. So the harbor master would say, put it in that old wreck. They're just trying to fill it up to make it the new key. And that's exactly what they did. So we had mostly layers of ballast excess ballast from other ships. And then also you get a little layer here and there of trash from the city of New York. There's one area, there's a whole bunch of scraps of leather that obviously come from a leather shop where they fix shoes and gloves and things like that. So we had a lot of scraps in one area. This is that same area. That was looking forward toward the north. And then this is that same area looking aft, south. And the ceiling planking has been taken off. And we've excavated in between the frames, so what you call ribs on a boat or frames on a ship. And we've excavated in there, and that was the only place that we knew when we found artifacts, those belonged to the shipbuilders. Had to have been, right? Because they were sealed in, if you will. And then in that layering that I talked about, the very bottom layer was about 6 inches thick, and it was flat through the ship. So I was pretty sure at the time that those artifacts were from the ship sailing time, and then it was covered. And later on, when someone did an analysis of the ceramic artifacts, sure enough, there's a big gap in dates between the artifacts that were in that lowest fill and then the next layers. So they have an idea that those artifacts come from the 12 years that the ship was sailing. Now, we had a big problem. At the end of the excavation, Shelley and I went home for the weekend and showered for about an hour each. Get all the mud off and out of our ears and hair and everything, and get rest. And we left a bunch of personal stuff in 2 boxes along the wall in the lab, and they were all marked. Went home, came back. They'd cleaned the lab, and they put the trash against the wall over there, and then they told the people who came for the trash, the trash is all along that wall. Now, in one of those boxes was Shelley's 2 notebooks, and she was the head of recording. So even though we had a lot of small notebooks where the individual archaeologists had written down the notes and the measurements, we couldn't tie it all together because it was gone. She had sketched a lot of things. If you saw the video, that was her sketching things and where did they measure from. As we went down, we had to keep having different datum points. Gone. Well, I had a minor in physics, so I had a lot of math. And I thought, I could figure this out. I just work it backwards. 15 years later, I had it all figured out. And and it was the buckets. We had bought a gross, 12 times 12 of pickle buckets to use as we were excavating. And I figured out, looking at the slides, eventually there was something leaning against it. They were exactly 12 inches in diameter. And from that, I could do some measurements from different photographs, even using parallax and all kinds of other things in mathematics. Was able to eventually tie it all together. So now the bow timbers. The bow timbers and other timbers, we kept them soaked in water. They went up to a lab that SSI had developed just for that, in big pools of water. And they were cleaned and soaked in different baths of water. And then the polyethylene glycol, which is a synthetic wax, or we call it PEG, it was submerged in that. That's a longer story, but then they came to the Mariners Museum. Why the Mariners Museum? Because, one, we couldn't find anybody in New York who wanted them. This would take up a large volume in a museum, and you can imagine what a large volume of space in Manhattan costs, and the rent that you're giving up, and that somebody has to watch it all the time, keep checking it. The humidity and the temperature has to be kept just right. And the museums in New York, strangely enough, didn't have much money. And what they did have was going into the floating ships, and they didn't want this. In the meantime, John Sands, who was director of collections here at the time, had been up to the ship early on as an invitation before we even took the bow out. And he said, wow, if there's any bit of this, we'd love to have it, because it looks to him, that this was a tobacco ship that was built in the South with live oak. And, he identified the timbers. And he said, we'd love to have that for our Chesapeake exhibit. Well, when we couldn't find anyone in New York, called down here, and they said, sure, bring it down here. So down it came, and I came with it about a week behind it, and stayed for 3 months to help get everything squared away and identify things. And we proceeded with a slow drying in the basement here, I guess. And that was it. And I stayed up, I ended up being curator here for a while. And that's where it left. And then administration changed here and said, well, we don't want to put it on exhibit. We have more important things to do. And I couldn't argue with that. And so, but lately there's a renewed interest in it. Here we have Jay Rosloff, who was a graduate student at Texas A&M. And we had recorded each of the timbers of the bow, every facet of it, every surface of it, one-to-one drawings. You put glass on it, trace it out. And he made a 1:5, I think, model of each piece, because to put it together. Because when we took it apart, it was freezing rain, and it was dark. It was that night, the last night, and we were all tired, and we didn't take any photographs because who's going to bring their camera out into freezing rain and mud? So he figured out how it really went together, and you could see that model. Some of you may have seen it in the background, which was good. And he ended up making the ship lines. I won't get into ship lines. If you know him, that's what he came up with for the bow. So what do we have? A ship this is a little larger than the ship. I'll call it the Ronson Ship. We called it the Ronson Ship for a long time. Ronson was, we said, okay, it was like if we worked an archaeology site on Jones's farm. It's the Jones Farm site. Okay, so this is Ronson Ship site. Pretty similar to this, only a little smaller. Okay? Three-masted, gun port, loading port, or lading port, and double deck. And this is from a 1717 engraving in New York City. Well, then I started the historical research, because remember, this is why I was so excited about this. As much as we might find from the ship the way it was, it'd be really nice if we could find out what ship it was and its history. And so I started going through the Naval Office shipping lists. So there was a clerk in every port who recorded ships coming and going, their size, who was the captain, et cetera, who owned it. And then every quarter, they would copy that and send it off to England. And the guys in England would look to see where the different ships went to make sure they were staying within the empire. Or if they went out of the empire, they had to have permission to do that. So they would watch that, and they had a general idea what was going on. Most of those records exist either here, the originals, or the copies over in England at the National Archives, which used to be the record office. But not all of them. There are big spaces that are just missing. Also, colonial and British newspapers from the time period. Unfortunately, the New York newspapers from that time period don't exist anymore anywhere. So that was not too good. And then there's a thing called Seaman's Sixpence. It was like an insurance policy. Any ship coming into London, it got recorded, and they were charged 6 pence per man on board, and that helped for the sailors' retirement home. So that was helpful. And what I did over the years, as I tried to make a living at the university and other things, having a child, and was to, by process of elimination, look at this. We knew the size of the vessel, so that gave us an approximate tonnage. Generally, what time period it was in, and also the woods. Now, the wood was tricky because the major timbers on the ship, they look like live oak, but there are other species of oak that are very similar to look at. And these were degraded. It's not as if you just cut it. And sent it off to the 3 scientific labs that specialize that in the United States. And every one of them said, yeah, well, it could be live oak, but it could also be this, that, or the other thing. Thanks. And it wasn't until 2010 that finally science caught up and had changed. And one of the wood scientists in, I think, the University of Michigan, Wisconsin, said this is definitely live oak. This is a southern oak. Now, live oak only exists naturally from about here down to Texas along the coast. It wasn't inland, wasn't farther north. So then I knew, okay, so all these other ships I was looking at, forget the ones that were built in Britain, forget the ones that were built north of Virginia. That gave me 5 ships to look at. And, okay, so, here's some records. You learn to read very strange things. These are Portuguese. This is 18th century Portuguese. Now, not just regular Portuguese in 18th century, it's ship clerks' abbreviations in Portuguese. Because I was looking at Madeira and the islands where a lot of the ships stopped. And you might be able to see it. It actually says in English, Princess Carolina up in there somewhere. But the rest of it's, what really gave it away were the shipworms in this ship. The wood had shipworms in it, teredos and bronchia. And the thing about shipworms is naturally they're very specific to certain areas around the world. Because of salinity and temperature, they can live in other places, but they can't reproduce in other places. Okay? And look at where these are from. There's not one of them that says North America. Kind of interesting. So, and the shipworms were all about 2 to 3 years old. not that I know this, the zoologist who wrote all the books about shipworms up at Harvard, so she looked at I sent some wood up to her, and she identified it all, and she told me about that. And I sat through a lecture of hers, and it was about shipworms' sex orgies in harbors. And basically, if one of them decides, hey, it's that time, usually in the summers, it's some of its chemicals that releases are then sensed by the other ones in the harbor, and within a day, everybody's having sex. And then the little babies go out and they look for dead wood, or they bump into it, and they go in, and that's it. They go right into the wood, they make a little hole, and then they go through and ruin the wood. So side of a ship is a wonderful thing. So that told me that this ship was in a warm port where other ships from these places would be at the same time, because that's the only place that could pick it up. And it wasn't the Chesapeake or anywhere in North America, because there would have been North American shipworms. Okay? So there were only two ports I could come up with logically that these 5 ships had been to. One was Lisbon, Portugal, and the other one was Madeira. That's why the Portuguese, right? And only one ship fit everything, and that was Princess Carolina. She was registered in America at 150 tons, 200 tons in England, which was normal. They used a different formula. Built in Charleston in 1717 by Benjamin Austin. Then I started searching about that and trying to find out about Austin, try to find out Charleston shipbuilding, etc. However, I ran into a couple of things. One was that in an article written by a very good historian from South Carolina, it said that a ship named Princess Carolina was built by Benjamin Austin, that they couldn't get the live oak, so they sent to Rhode Island and Virginia for the wood. Well, that negated Princess Carolina because it's made with live oak. But maybe it came from Virginia. But in those days, they didn't really move heavy timbers that far. They didn't do it. I was scratching my head for a long time. Well, I went down to Charleston to do some research about Austin, and I came across the letter that this historian had read. And his sentence was just part of something he was writing about something else. And it turned out he had misunderstood what was being written. And what they did was, Charleston was at war with the local tribes. So they were surrounded by the enemy. And the French and they had made a raid at St. Augustine, and the French and the Spanish were after them. And it was a little town. And they could get the live oak there, but they couldn't get out into the forest to get the white oak and the pine that would be out in the uplands because the Indians were there. So that's what they sent for. And that's right in the letter. So that all fit for Princess Carolina being the right ship. Now, the ship went out and had an interesting career. It seems like it was built in Charleston. Some merchants paid for it to be built, and Austin might have had some part of it, because the British ships and the New England ships wouldn't come down to Charleston. It was too dangerous. And they could make they could make good money by coming into the Chesapeake and picking up tobacco and heading back out, or go into New York and carry goods back and forth. But why go to Charleston? So they didn't have a big ship. So they had to build their own, and that was this ship. So we see it going back and forth between Charleston and London, just shuttling. And then a fellow named Perry, Micaiah Perry, bought it. He was London, and he traded a lot in tobacco and other expensive goods, especially the best tobacco. And the best of the tobacco at that time came from this area right here. So, but he traded to here, but he also seemed to send this ship wherever he needed cargo picked up or dropped off. So it moved around quite a bit. Forget the triangle trade. This ship was going here, there, and everywhere, depending on the need. You'll notice where that line is, there's a break for a few years. And that's because there wasn't much shipping then because of the economic disaster caused by the bubble created by the South Sea Company. If some of you may be into that, it was a boondoggle, and the economy of Great Britain collapsed and took a few years to rebuild. So a lot of ships were laid up. This one was laid up, but then picked up again too. One thing we had noticed while we were excavating, right, in your mast, it sits in a socket, and that's called a mast step. It's a big hunk of wood with a hole in it. Usually, all kinds of changes. The foremast step, the mast up in the front, the step, we found the original one was broken, big time, all cracked open. And another one had been crudely made and put on top and spiked in with a whole bunch of spikes. And it was a little offset in the front. Man, what the hell? You know, no shipwright would do that. They would take the old one out, put a good one back in. Bob's your uncle, and sail away. This thing was jury-rigged, probably at sea or some little cove somewhere. So it probably was in a storm, and it must have been a storm in the last voyage. And then the ship came in, and they just condemned it because it was an old ship. It had done its thing for 12 years. And that was our sort of working hypothesis. So I was looking for evidence of that with Princess Carolina. And eventually, out of the blue, an archivist in Richmond at the State Archives came to me and said, hey, you were looking for stuff on Princess Carolina. Says it was in a big storm and lost at sea. What? Not my ship. And what happened was it was in a convoy leaving Virginia with tobacco. And this was from a report by a British Navy officer. He had a frigate, and he was convoying 30 ships, tobacco ships, out of Virginia to London because there was a Spanish privateer in the area, and these guys needed protection. And so his report to the Admiralty was, we started out, got into a big storm, and everybody was scattered. We gathered up the next morning, and 2 ships didn't show up, but we saw some debris, including a bunch of casks and stuff. And we assumed those 2 ships were lost with all hands, and off they sailed. They didn't wait around. And I understand that, he had a job to do, 28 ships he had to protect. So off they went, and he gave him that report. That report then went down to the Caribbean, and they publicized it. It came back into the colonies up here, and it was in the newspapers up here that Princess Carolina and Francis were lost. That was the only means of communication with these ships. Well, so I said, they must have had it wrong. I mean, a lot of ships over time, in fact, it happened right in my hometown. It was a hurricane hit, and the ship was washed out to sea with 3 men on board. And after a couple of weeks, nobody showed up. Okay, they've gone to see Davy Jones. And then a few weeks after that, they showed up in New Jersey. I'm talking about from Maine to New Jersey. So they had jury-rigged a sail and made it into New Jersey and lived. And so I thought, that must be what happened. And that's the way I wrote the books. That's the way things were until about a month ago. A month ago, a guy contacted me, and he was doing some research, genealogical research. And he said, I think one of my ancestors came over on Princess Carolina and said the captain was Holiday, which would be right. And he said, I said, well, that'd be great. I said, that's a bit of information I didn't know. What was his name, da-da-da. And we exchanged things. And he said, oh, did you see this thing about, and I said, I think Holiday was, did you have anything on Holiday? No. And he came back, he said, there's this unpublished thing in my family, and it cites this letter or something, and from that time period. It was a report, and Holiday survived. And it said he threw the tobacco overboard to save the ship and lived to sail another day. And he was putting in for the money he said, this wasn't my fault, that we lost this cargo. We threw it overboard to save the ship and the crew. So that, underlying that, we do have Princess Carolina, because everything really ties together now. Now, go back a bit. Micaiah Perry, who owned the ship, he worked as an agent. He bought and sold tobacco, but he also worked as an agent, meaning tobacco growers here in Virginia, these three men from this area, they're quite illustrious actually in politics and things, they would send their tobacco over and he would be the selling agent for that. So you could sell your tobacco here in Virginia to the English or the Scottish and get one price, but if you sent it over and you took the risk of sending it over, you got a better price in England. And that's what these guys did, using Perry as an agent. And this shows where they, see the Mariners Museum, is here. And this is where these people were. So we have, records of the ship coming in here, Perry's ship. These are the three guys in this area that he traded with. So it's a pretty close tie-in to this area. And remember John Sands, who said, oh, we'd like that ship. It may have been a tobacco ship. And we weren't sure of the tie-in to the Mariners Museum, but bang, there it is. So I said I could figure this out. One of the things, remember the question was, how do they build these ships? How do they design these ships? We didn't know. And so I started working on that at the same time. And I was looking, this is John Dean, this is one of the treatises on how to build a ship at the time. It's a warship. This was maybe 50 years before, 30 years before our ship was built. And notice how complex that gets, trying to figure out where the center of your arc is. Where is that? And there's all these complex fractions. But he just gives you an idea, but this ship was not built that way. How could you possibly remember well, some people could, how to do that and keep it a secret. And so I tried his method, it didn't fit. I tried each of the treatises' methods, each of the shipbuilders' methods that we had treatises for that have survived, none of them fit. Spent hours, hundreds, thousands of hours drawing these out, trying to get it to fit our ship. It wouldn't fit. So I was thinking, I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, if this really was memorized. And Austin, turned out, came from a shipbuilding family, a Scottish shipbuilding family. If they had a secret, it must have been simple enough to memorize. And why not? So I started thinking simpler terms. What are some numbers they could use? Well, part of it was, we had this ship, it was sort of discombobulated and falling apart in the ground. So the next step maybe was to look at it sideways, try to figure that out. And it was interesting that the groove, called the stem rabbet, in the bow, had to be, it was one of the few things on the ship that wouldn't have moved while it was underground because it's carved in. And it formed a perfect arc of 16 feet radius. Okay? And there was a lower, there was a breast hook that held the two sides together, and it had a radius of 8 feet arc. That starts to be a pattern, you know? And I tried to figure out by putting lines that were perpendicular to the curve of the side of the ship and see where he may have started with the arcs, but it never worked out very well because, again, I was working with our data in the field. So it was time to make a model. Every piece that we had, all of the data that I had figured out and reverse engineered, if you will, and to make a model of each piece and see how it fit together so that we could see what the ship actually looked like when it was built. I was about to do that, and all of a sudden I got a small grant out of nowhere to hire a summer intern. Aha. I'll find a summer intern who can make the models for me while I do some more other research. And this is Carrie Atkins. She was, I believe, a sophomore going to be a junior. And this was in June, so it was pretty hard to find a summer intern. And she was looking for an internship. I said, well, do you know anything about making models? No. You know anything about ships? No. But her professor had said she was brilliant. I said, okay, here are some books. Read these books, that's your first week. At the end, she would read this book by Dick Steffi on how you reconstruct ships from timbers and stuff. Graduate students have a tough time understanding that book. She understood it perfectly, asked a few questions. She made the model, and she took my drawings and found mistakes I had made, corrected them. And she worked on this for 2 summers and really, whoops, I pushed the wrong button, and really solved exactly how the ship looked when it was built. And that's the model of everything that we were allowed to see. We didn't see the starboard side of the ship that was under the street. So now we had the ship as it was built, but it's not built like it was designed because you're working with wood. So you got the big timber, you're looking for a curved piece of timber that fits over here. Yeah, we don't have one. Okay, so if you're really good, you know just how to move it right to still have a really good ship, but it doesn't fit the design, but that's okay, you know, this is still a good ship. And that's what the guy did, and we knew that, we could see that. So I couldn't do the design right from that, but I worked on it. And eventually realized that part of my problem had been that the ship was moving while we were measuring it. Some of it I couldn't work out, but it turned out that the ship was actually kind of breathing. Remember I said we filled it with water, we let it fill up with water each night? And then the next day we'd excavate more and then it filled. Well, as we went down, the pressure of the mud around it was pushing in slowly. And so it was sort of like breathing during the day, coming in on us, but so slowly we didn't notice it in the field. So our data kept changing. And that was one of the problems I was having. And when I finally realized that, I could go back and reconstruct what Austin had done. I've already talked about this slide. All right. So I realized that he had built this ship using 4 feet as his base. Just like you'd build a house today with 4x8 plywood and, you know, everything's multiples or divisions with 4 feet. That's the way he built this ship. So we're looking here. I'm going to get a little technical, so if you're not into that, follow along. There won't be a quiz, but I know some of you are interested, so I'm going to spend maybe 5 minutes going through the technical part. To get the midship frame, which is a third of the way back on this ship, and it's the center area. 12 foot, 3 times 4, radius, arc, come down like that. And then that would hit hard on the floor of the ship. So used a 4 foot radius arc that was tangent to that arc and the bottom. And so you end up with that shape for the midship frame. And he made the center of the ship for 14, I think, frames is exactly the same. Why did he do that? Because it goes through the water better. So he's got the bow, which makes a hole in the water, and then straight sides going back for quite a ways, for about 30 feet. And it gives you a nice sort of semi-square area for your cargo too. And then you have the stern sort of closing that hole. And then going forward, so he had the center right on that major arc, right on the center line of the ship, and a 12-foot arc, but it was 10 feet off the keel. So then the next frame going forward from that cargo area that was all the same was frame F. He moved the center, right? It's still on the center line of the radius, but it's 1 foot up. And he cut that 12-foot arc and then the 4 foot to make it tangent. And notice the floor is getting thinner. And then 1 foot up, they are same arcs. And so since it's 12 feet, it comes right, it's at 12 feet high, 12-foot arc, comes right to the keel, and it's got one round keel. Next two frames, again, using the 12-foot for the arc, and then he switches to an 8-foot arc up on top as he's going forward. Notice where the center of that 12-foot, the 8-foot arc is at the same, it's at 13 feet, the same height as the center for the 12, but it's over 4 feet. Okay, those are 2-foot squares. And then he made what I call, because nobody else had found this thing, I could call it anything I want, a bow offset line. See the line with the dots on it? And so he uses that, I use that as the center of all the rest of his arcs, his 8-foot arcs. You can see going, I've skipped some frames here, otherwise I'd have you here all night. And I could go on and on and on because I love this. And so that's the bow, and the stern was very similar, except this is the very back. So these are the last 2 frames coming up. And again, he had an offset line back there that he used. How did I come up with the offset lines? That's the way the arcs worked. I could see where he put his compass, or he may have done this in full scale, we don't know. And so, again, if you're into this is basically the right side is the front half of the ship, and the left side's the back half of the ship. And it's as if you had a loaf of bread and you cut it like that. It shows the different shapes going forward. And if you're really into ship lines, this is what the rest of it looks like. But those of you who are, notice this. Well, if you have it smooth, it's called fair, okay, F-A-I-R. This is not fair. If you go to put a plank on the ship, it's going, what's going on? And it's because when he made that shift from 12 feet to 8 feet, it wasn't a smooth shift. So what was he going to do? What shipwrights have always done. You put some shims in there to make sure that the plank works fine. I checked with some people who do restoration of real old wooden ships, and I said, 2 guys, one at Mystic Seaport, guy in Maine, shipbuilders, and I said, what would you do? Is this true? He said, oh, yeah, you put some shims in. The other guy said, oh, yeah, you put some shims in. It works. Don't worry about it. So I'm quite sure this is what he did, because it fits and nothing else does. And of course, you could memorize that. 12 foot, 8 foot, 4 feet, easy. Also, in this second volume, I'm not trying to sell you a book. I get like 53 cents for every book. So I put a lot of, I explain that in detail, and I put a lot of the details of construction in there. How was the gun port built, and explain it. So there's 52 illustrations and a lot of explanation. So What have we learned? Well, analyzing the ship, we see a very efficient ship. With that flat bottom through the cargo area, it's slower, it can hold more cargo than the faster ships that had been, the British had. Their merchant ships were always going in harm's way. So their hulls, when you looked at them earlier, they were more like warships. They had to have speed, and they had to be well armed because they were colonizing over in America, and the Spanish and the French are fighting, and the Dutch are fighting with everybody. Their merchant ships had to be well armed and fast. But during the wars that ended in 1713, they captured a lot of ships. And there was a Dutch type that's called a flyboat, or flute or flout, depending on what your nationality was. And these were kind of big square things that went through the water, very bluff bow, could hardly sail out of their own way, not even armed usually. They always were in areas that were safe. And I think what this created, the Scottish family did, was to take some of that and some of the old English shipbuilding design and put them together into a ship that had a good cutting bow and a nice closing stern to make it fairly efficient, and then a big area in the middle for cargo. The other thing is that with that flat bottom, it's more stable. And so when you think you're out at sea and a squall's coming, you see the squall line, well, you may not see it at night until it hits you. And all of a sudden, ship wants to go over and disappear. But if you've got a flat bottom under there, it's a lot slower. It's a lot more stable. Gives a crew more time to react. So you can sail with a smaller crew. One of the reasons they might have a big crew is they could take care of those problems. So this kind of a ship, instead of having about 20 men on board, probably sailed with 15, 16 men max, okay? Saves money, not just with salary, but food, space that you could use for cargo. So these were more efficient. The problem is, we only found one. So was this an anomaly? Was it a successful type? We don't know till somebody finds another one. But I would propose that it was because this guy didn't make this up. You know, he didn't sit down there. He was come from a shipbuilding family. He wasn't known to make fast ships or anything. He made ships that worked. The ship lasted for 12 years until it was in a bad storm and the timbers would have been old anyway at that point after going through so many storms at sea. And it was efficient. I think it was a winner in that sense. So why wouldn't it be a type that was used? And the shallow draft also helped it to get in it. Charleston has a sandbar, or did, and so you needed a more shallow draft. So that fit Charleston nicely. And the Chesapeake, of course, is fairly shallow. Ship could get up in there better. And I think we've answered Ralph Davis's hypothesis about merchant ships being more efficient. And maybe this is the solution. Maybe this ship has helped us solve that question of why the British Empire was able to grow so much, that the red blood cells, if you will, have become more efficient. Not that that was by any means the only reason, but it was one of 8 or 9 reasons that we could come up with. I may be proved wrong, but that's what I'm running with at the moment. And the merchants, in the Chesapeake, in London, Charleston, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, using these vessels to expand, to get wealthy, to hire more people, which would attract immigrants to come to what's now the United States, because the economy was good. But as I said, one man, one family, one ship. I'm hoping that others find others. We learned some more about Manhattan development too.